this is the last module, and this is module 5.2, the ovarian and the uterine cycle. So after learning about the physical structures of the female reproductive system, we will now be talking about or reviewing the hormonal control of the reproductive system of the females. So first of all, we already discussed this. Menarche means the initial start of the uterine cycle, start of menstruation. We talk about that menopause, the cycle become irregular and eventually disappear because of the ultimate lessening or even a bit disappearing of the important hormones like progesterone, estrogen. So menopause will be caused by that. So this is menarche happens around 11 to 12 years old, menstruation 12 to 50 years old, and menopause will be around 50 years up to death. So what are the important hormones in the human female reproductive system? So it's almost the same with the male except for the female hormone. So you have the gonadotrophin releasing hormone. Again, this is secreted by the hypothalamus. You have the follicle stimulating hormone and also the luteinizing hormone, which would be secreted by the anterior pituitary gland as it is affected by the GnRH. And then finally, you have the estrogen and the progesterone, which are produced by the ovaries as it is influenced by the hormones from the anterior pituitary gland. Let's talk about that. So for the anterior pituitary gland, the FSH stimulates follicular growth. So the follicles are being induced by this hormone. It stimulates estrogen production as well. So later we'll be seeing that. The LH, luteinizing hormone, remember it only has one job, more or less. Its surge causes ovulation and results also in the formation of the corpus luteum when the egg cell has been ovulated. Now in terms of the ovaries, you have here the estrogen. So estrogen is very important in thickening the uterine lining, the endometrium, inhibits FSH and LH, and stimulates FSH and LH release pre-ovulation. Progesterone, on the other hand, also would be thickening the uterine lining, the endometrium, and also inhibit the FSH and LH. Of course, if there's too much FSH, too much LH, and then it has already ovulated, then there might be hyperovulation, producing more of the egg cells ovulation. So there is a need to really cut the production of the FSH and the LH. So let's now start with this. So the hypothalamus, as you already know, produces the GnRH, which affects the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary then releases the FSH and LH. So FSH stimulates the follicle, while the LH causes ovulation. Now take note, as we have mentioned, the primordial follicles will be stimulated by the FSH to produce a mature follicle eventually, and this follicle actually the one that produces the estrogen. Now the estrogen is very important for female characteristic, development of the breast, the vulva, the vagina, the uterus, the endometrium especially. So as we already mentioned, the estrogen will cause the initial increase of the endometrium in preparation for the implantation of the embryo. So we'll look at that a little bit later. Now the negative feedback is if it's too much estrogen is now produced, it will cause the GnRH and the FSH to eventually stop production, lessen production, because as we mentioned a while ago, we don't want overstimulation of the follicles resulting to over-ovulation. Too much egg cells, too much fertilization might happen there. Okay, and then finally the LH will surge. Only one job, it will be releasing the egg cell. So let's look at what will happen here. So that's the what we call as the feedback mechanism. So since the egg cell has been released, then the estrogen will start to decrease, but at the same time the progesterone will start to increase this time. Alright, so we have to talk about the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle. These are cycles of the female that are actually interconnected with each other. So let's look at this one. Do remember the important stages of the ovarian and the uterine cycle. Ovarian, two phases: follicular phase and the luteal phase. The follicular phase is where the follicles are being developed, separated by the ovulation in this around 14 days. And then since the egg cell has been removed, then you will now have the corpus luteum, which will be the luteal phase. The follicular phase, you will see later, produces the estrogen. The luteal phase, later you will see, produces the progesterone, both of which will help the endometrium to become thickened in order to enable implantation of the embryo. The uterine cycle, which will be related with the menstrual cycle, starts with the menstrual phase because the previous endometrial lining is now being slowed off, is now being removed, and it is now turned into blood, which flows as menses or menstruation. But as the follicles start to develop, the proliferative phase of the uterine cycle happens here, wherein the endometrium again becomes thickened initially. After that, when the ovulation happens, what will happen here is that the estrogen will decline because there's no more egg cell present in the follicle. The follicle has disappeared. But now, the thickening of the endometrium will be done by the progesterone because in the secretory phase, the corpus luteum will secrete the progesterone to further the thickening of the endometrium. So we'll be looking at that. So this is the ovary. 1, 2, 3, 4 stages will be the follicular stages. So this is where the follicular phase, the maturity or the maturation of the follicles. Then you have here the ovulation of the egg cell, and finally the remaining portion without the egg cell now becomes corpus luteum and will disintegrate, and it will now become the luteal phase. But in this portion, the follicular phase, estrogen will be produced. Once the egg cell is removed, it will decrease. But since the corpus luteum has been produced and eventually disappear, more of the progesterone will be produced, which also thicken the endometrial lining. So you can see here the follicular phase increases the follicle, matures it, ovulation happens at the 14th day, and the luteal phase will happen over here. Now, combining that with the uterine cycle, you now see that the follicles are developing. Menstrual phase happen here. The proliferative increases because of the increase in the estrogen. Then the egg cell will be released, but the estrogen will decrease. But the corpus luteum produces the progesterone with further increase. So you will notice there is an increase in the endometrium lining in preparation for the possible fertilization of the egg cell and possible implantation of the zygote in the endometrium that will later become the baby. So again, ovarian, follicular phase, and luteal phase, uterine, menstrual phase, proliferative phase, and secretory phase, MPS. So that will be quite easy to remember. Alright, so that is the same thing. So we're already done with this. So progesterone is produced in the secretory phase. So let's look at the cycles here. So the estrogen increases because of the presence of the follicle, which causes the proliferative phase to increase initially the endometrium. But when the egg cell is almost released through ovulation, it will fall down. And then there is the progesterone increasing here that will increase the endometrium in the secretory phase because of the presence of corpus luteum over here. So that will be very important. Take note, LH surge, which will be very important for the ovulation, and the FSH also would be following such a path. So that's all about the last portion of